Well, let's go ahead and get started. I want to have enough time for questions. If this is your first time joining, go ahead and you're welcome to chat. We do mute everybody's line so we have enough time to get through the content. And we do record these sessions on Monday nights. So if you do miss one or you want a topic, we have a pretty good library that you can find now on our YouTube channel. So look forward to kind of getting to know all of you through the process of training and learning on Monday nights. My name is Rochelle Wilhite. I'm the designated broker of Best Choice Realty. Tonight's topic is going to be about earnest money. And one of the things about earnest money that is important to know is we actually did this class less than a year ago. And because of the changes to the contract, we have to redo it because we are seeing a significant amount of mistakes that are being made by not our agents. Sometimes it is our agents. For the most part, we have been well trained in the earnest money provisions in the contract, but some of our colleagues and other companies have not been trained. And so this session is really to learn about earnest money in Washington State, how it's collected, how it's done, what are some provisions you need to be concerned about. I'll go over a few bloopers and challenges and even share with you a recent audit finding in the next 15-20 minutes, and hopefully have enough time the last 5 minutes to take your Q&A, really centered around earnest money non-refundable. So I'm seeing that a lot in the negotiations, and we certainly want to be using the clause correctly and communicating correctly what the intent of the parties would be doing in those circumstances. So we're going to jump right in. Thanks for jumping on a few minutes early. And we look forward to continuing our discussions about earnest money. Let's go to the next slide, Shannon. So what is earnest money? Who holds it? What are the remedies in the event of a default? We're seeing earnest money checks or wires in the amounts of $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. In fact, it's not unheard of to see $100,000 or $125,000 earnest money check, and you're like, whoa, really? Yes, people are looking at the lack of inventory and seeing that shows strength to the seller, which it does. Earnest money, and the way I used to explain it to my new buyers, people that have never bought a home before, is earnest money shows the seller you're serious. It's money that you've set aside for the purchase, generally speaking, and you are putting that into an escrow account to hold the purchase and sale agreement intact. Shows the seller you're serious. And so obviously the more money you have in earnest, the better it looks to the seller. So we want to make sure that you guys are writing these up correctly in the contract. They did change the contract recently, just a couple months ago in March. And so they do kind of cleaned it up. So it basically says how much money. You do need to check the appropriate box. We used to write wire or ACH. In the other section, they now have provided a wire box. Most of the money that we're seeing in excess of $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 is usually in the form of a wire. So when you're doing a wire and you're checking that box, I hope to goodness you've given your clients, your buyer, that wire fraud alert, that disclosure, because if you have not, and there's something that happens with their $50,000 earnest money check, there is no insurance that will protect you or protect the firm for that wire fraud. So be sure that you are giving the proper disclosures. That's just a reminder from class from contract negotiation that you might have taken a few months ago. But I'm seeing more wires than I have seen checks in residential purchases, probably the most we've ever seen in an entire history of doing business in Washington. However, you still can do a personal check. Just think about it. If you're in a multiple offer situation and you check the check box, then you write a personal check and then it has to go through the Federal Reserve, and there's a process of doing that. If you're going to make your earnest money and turn it into a non-refundable, then a check is not going to work because it does take a period of 3 to 5 days for it to clear the Federal Reserve. So in that case, you definitely want to make sure that it's a wire or it's an ACH or some sort of liquid cashier's check. It has to be that form in order for you to turn it into a non-refundable earnest money. Okay, the delivery date 5 days after mutual acceptance. In the past contract that we had in Washington, it kind of had a 3-day built-in clause and another couple days, and it was very confusing. They've made it very easy. But I asked Jerry Kay, our managing broker who reviews the contracts, how many people are messing up on the delivery date, like the date of the earnest money that's recorded at escrow. How many of them are late? And you know what, you guys, even with all of the training and the education that we've done and the emails that get sent, we're seeing over half of the earnest monies are in default or are late because of that section 7, where you enter maybe 2 days. You want to make sure that you have enough time to get the wiring instructions or the ACH instructions from your escrow company, or that the client has able to write the check out and get it to escrow and deliver it. Some escrow companies, one just last week, it was over 45 minutes and they only had one location. So it was almost near impossible to make the cutoff when our agent wrote in 2 days after mutual acceptance that check was going to be deposited to escrow. So make sure when you're writing up the contract, I know it's really busy and you guys are writing up a ton of contracts right now to get them accepted, that you consider when that earnest money delivery date is going to be. It might need to be 5 days. It might need to be 2 days. Maybe it's a cashier's check. Have a conversation with that client to make sure that you have enough time to get the wiring instructions or the cashier's check delivered to escrow to make that delivery date. Like I said, we're close to 50% not getting delivered on time, and that's concerning. When we write the contract at Best Choice Realty, we are always selecting the box closing agent. We never want to use buyer brokerage firm. If you are representing a seller and you have a buyer's agent from, say, another company, I'm just going to pick on one, Coldwell Banker, for example. There are Coldwell Banker offices that do hold the earnest money, use their trust account in that way. And it's okay in certain circumstances to accept an offer or advise the seller accept the offer only after you've spoken to me and we've had a good relationship, understanding that that company is a reputable company and using their trust funds appropriately. So if you're representing a buyer, we always use closing agent. We don't use our trust account in that manner. But if you're representing a seller, once in a while, you will have a buyer's agent that checks the other box where it says buyer brokerage firm, and you will need to either counter them and have it held in escrow or speak with me on how their designated broker handles those funds. It could be simply a mistake. That new agent that wrote the offer checked the wrong box. We want to make sure it's the best interest of the seller, and most of the time, having the escrow company or the closing agent handle that is the best for the seller rather than the other one. So there are certain circumstances where that might not be the case, but that's rare. Number 8, you always check forfeiture of earnest money. Only rarely would you want to do the seller election or remedies, but when you're representing a buyer and seller, it's easier to go ahead and check, and it's safer to check the forfeiture of earnest money because that's when default would occur. How does default occur? Well, in the event the buyer fails without excuse, there is forfeiture or there's seller election of remedies. So basically, you've got the portion of the earnest money that does not exceed 5%. That is the part that is the sole and exclusive remedy available to the seller. Now, if you're dealing with, say, 5 million, 10 million, 20 million, you may want to have the counter with seller election of remedies, but that will incur legal expenses in order to handle a potential default. So you would want to find out from the seller what they are wanting to accept. Sometimes it's easier and most common just to do forfeiture of earnest money. Somebody asked me one time, how many times have I ever seen the seller election of remedies? I don't have enough. Maybe 5 to 6 times in my entire career have I ever seen seller election of remedies. So in this purchase and sale agreement. So we don't see it very often, but when we do, there's usually reasoning behind that, or it's a certain purchase price or a seller situation that needs to be handled in that manner. Okay, let's go to the next slide. What happens if the earnest money is not deposited? This has happened, and it's happened recently. Even in the last month, we've had a couple incidents where the earnest money was not deposited and we represented the seller. In that case, when you check, it is your responsibility as the listing agent to verify that the earnest money has been deposited with the escrow company or with the firm, that we have proof in our files that that has occurred. It's our duty as a listing agent to check that. If you are new to the business or you're new to listing homes, what could potentially happen is that the buyer's agent drops the ball. Maybe they're late. Maybe it doesn't get deposited. If it's not deposited within the section we discussed earlier, the seller has the option to send over a 90B, and that would give notice of termination to that buyer's agent. This has happened to us where we had multiple offers. The first offer came in, it was desirable, but then the second, third offer actually was even more desirable. And so the seller wanted to hold that first buyer accountable to making sure that earnest money was deposited. And it was not, it was late. And so the seller had a choice, and our listing agent did a great job with the advice of Jerry Kay in properly sending over the notice of termination to terminate that first buyer and go with this backup buyer and end up making approximately $10,000 more on the purchase price, and working with a better broker, a better buyer's agent by doing so. Anytime you send over a notice of termination or a notice, if you have not done these notices before, you probably want to speak with me or speak with Jerry Kay and work together in knowing when to send it and the strategy behind it, because it has to be properly delivered. Anytime you send a notice of termination, it has to be sent to the listing, to the firm. So it has to be sent to the buyer's firm, the buyer's agent, the buyer's agent's firm, the listing agent, which would be us. Obviously, we want to get the seller to sign off on it, and our firm. So all of those people, or those email addresses, have to be in the same kind of email thread, so that the notice of termination is date stamped, time stamped for delivery. And that has to be done properly within the right time. So you have a very, very small window sometimes to verify that. And so you really want to watch your timelines when you're the listing agent to make sure that that buyer's agent has deposited the earnest money. Okay. And then alert the seller if it has not been delivered in time, because the seller has an option. And the state of Washington, it is your duty. Go to the next slide, Shannon. I believe it's on the next slide. The state of Washington has, now let's go to the next one real quick. Sorry, I'm skipping around. Grab the RCW code. There we go. What RCW codes right there in computation of time says that at any specified time, 5 days or less, does not include the weekends or the holidays. So you have to understand as a listing agent, when does that earnest money need to be delivered? You'll need to kind of go into computation of time and make sure that anytime it's less than 5 days, in this case, it's 5 days or less typically with earnest money delivery, that it does not include the weekend, does not include the holiday. And so when we go back to the calendar, if you can flip back to the calendar, Shannon, that would be great. When a mutual, let's just say, for example, on Tuesday, and this is going to happen here coming up 4th of July weekend, we're going to have 4th of July as a holiday. 4th of July happens to be on the 4th, but the legal holiday might be considered the 5th. So in this instance, in September, this was a Labor Day thing. 5 days after mutual acceptance would be, when do you actually have to have your earnest money delivered? And mutually signed around and delivered on the 1st of September, that's day 0. That means computation of time. If we had a 5-day delivery of earnest money, we would have, and we were representing the buyer, we'd have Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday and Sunday and Monday would not count. We actually would have until Wednesday at 9 p.m. Escrow closes at 5 p.m. But we would have till 9 p.m. on the 9th. On Wednesday to get our earnest money turned in. If the earnest money was not turned in appropriately, then on the 10th, the seller would have the opportunity to terminate if it was not turned in. And that may be something they want to take up. You want to take up with your seller, or you may want to say, you know what, I understand the buyers had some sort of circumstance and there needs to be some email correspondence to make it okay that the seller knew it was going to be late or the buyer was running into some difficulty and the parties agreed that it was okay to be late, and then no notice is sent over. And oftentimes that's what occurs. Earnest money is close to 50% right now are late, but the parties are in agreement that it's okay, and the deal progresses till the close of escrow. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, the next one. These are typical situations. So buyers come up from San Diego, didn't expect to buy anything. They found a lot, they made an offer. Super exciting, right? They didn't have their checkbook with them. So by the time they got back to San Diego and they sent the earnest money, it was later than the 3 days. So this was a typical situation. In fact, it came up in one of our audits that we had to respond to. We get audited a lot, you guys. So don't be offended if Jerry K sends you or I send you an email saying, hey, I'm looking for when did the date? Was there any more communication between you and the seller in this instance? Because the auditors, they've added more auditors down at Washington State, and they actually are doing more checks with the designated brokers and the managing brokers to make sure earnest monies are being handled appropriately. Most of the complaints they receive from consumers are related around earnest money delivery. So we want to make sure that we are able to deal with these typical situations. So a situation like this, you may want to, instead of having 3 days, you may want to, knowing that the clients have to go back, get their checkbook, and maybe we want to do wire, or maybe we want to give ourselves some more time, or maybe we want to write the earnest money that we actually, especially a vacant lot, maybe we don't have our earnest money be delivered until removal of our feasibility contingency on a vacant lot. There are ways to handle those certain circumstances. And if you've never experienced these types of things, you can certainly call me or call managing broker, and we can provide you with language to either extend that part of the contract or to write it up to give yourself that amount of time, as long as you're not in a multiple offer situation. In that case, it was not a multiple offer situation. Number 2, the buyers are from Auburn, so Washington, stayed up here a few days on vacation before returning home to send the earnest money funds to escrow. So it's a lot of just timing. A lot of this could be prevented by having more conversation or providing more time or more communication with escrow to make sure that you have the proper wiring, cashier's check, or just the more counsel really with your buyers and how earnest money is done. Most of the earnest money checks that we are seeing are done through wires now. So that might be just a simple change in how you explain when you start working with the buyer how earnest money is handled, typically now with COVID behind us. We've kind of gone to that practice where things are done without touching the money or running to escrow or creating more hassle, driving and staying in traffic. Number 3, the buyers are from Whidbey Island and wanted to hand carry. So there are some people that are not wanting to deal with wire fraud, wanting to take their earnest money directly to the company that's going to actually sign their documents. My buyers sometimes are like that. They're very, very sensitive in how they want to handle their earnest money. But the earnest money, the ferries were delayed and they were not running. So there was a delay because of that occurred. In that circumstance, you may want to have a conversation with that listing agent sooner rather than later and provide for some sort of communication so that you know that the seller will not be sending a notice of termination. They will go ahead and grant the buyer some additional time to get it turned in. Number 4, this happens a lot. Buyers got a FedEx label from escrow and they sent the money that way. That is common as well. But when you talk about FedEx, things get delayed. The receiving of when the escrow company receives it, it could be late just because of that. And then number 5, I don't want you guys dealing with this, but some buyers, especially some of our newer buyers, maybe their first time buying, they think they can terminate the deal by not depositing their earnest money. A complete no-no. They get cold feet and then, I hope to goodness that the buyer's agent has properly counseled that buyer and provided for some sort of contingency so they can exit the situation properly. But even if they're planning to use their inspection contingency as a way to terminate the contract, if they have written in a 3-day earnest money delivery into their contract, they're required, even if they're going to exit the contract on inspection, they still are required to deliver their earnest money per the contract. They cannot just say, I'm just changing my mind, unless they get a 35R signed around, understanding that they are going to terminate and there's a proper exit of the contract. There's some circumstances like that that would allow for that to happen. But buyers cannot terminate just because they don't want to deliver their earnest money. So make sure that they don't misunderstand. In some contracts like refinances, there's like a 3-day right of rescission. There's not a 3-day right of rescission in the instance of a purchase and sale agreement when it comes to earnest money. There is a deposit and there is a delivery and there is a provision, and the sellers can sue, not only just for their earnest money, but they can sue for performance, and it's not good for the buyer if it gets to that point. So be sure you counsel them that the reason of what they need to do, and make sure you provide an exit strategy if you have a buyer that's very, very wishy-washy. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this is another WAC code. I mean, I kind of alluded to it earlier, but the brokers are required to keep the party to whom they provided brokerage services informed of their earnest money deposit status, and must retain and provide copies of the receipts to the principals and the participating firms. So it's your responsibility as a buyer's agent and a listing agent. So somebody asked me, Rochelle, is it the buyer's agent that has to handle the earnest money or the listing agent? It's actually both. Both brokers are responsible to keep the parties informed of the earnest money deposit status. That's WAC code 308. I believe it's been modified slightly over the years. And in fact, it was modified because I looked at the slide from last year and it was changed. So we want to make sure that you guys are well informed in terms of the WAC code. Let's go to the next slide. There's a $5,000 fine. I don't know if you heard that from Jerry Kay, but if you fail to deposit or it's considered late, now there is some grace. Luckily for us, there's been some grace, because in our last audit, there were 3 occurrences, and that could be potentially $5,000 per occurrence. Luckily, this broker, it was her first sighting. And so they went ahead and we provided a detailed explanation. We provided a full file workup. And so the Department of Licensing went ahead and waived the fines that could be imposed for failure to deliver or the earnest money being late in those circumstances. But that's still a lot of money. And I would not want you guys having to have that on your record or have any issues. Luckily, they've been fairly good to work with, especially due to COVID and some of the instances that we've heard. But just be very careful as you're progressing. Maybe let your clients know that we need to get your earnest money turned in. Otherwise, I run the risk of having to pay a late, a significant late fine because it's not handled appropriately. Okay, let's go to the next slide. What constitutes late? Well, buyer turns in the earnest money to escrow any day after the day indicated on the purchase and sale agreement. Wires can sometimes be late. If you miss the wiring cutoff, right? We get the instructions from escrow. Say we got mutual on Sunday. Monday, we're trying to scramble to kind of get people what they need and make sure that we get inspection turned. And then by Tuesday, we decide, oh, we need to get that open with escrow. We need to send them the purchase and sale agreement. But then we actually don't get the wire set up until after the wiring cutoff. That happens quite frequently. So make sure if you are going to check the box wire that you contact the escrow company right away, the moment you go mutual, because that's day 0, and get their instructions. Escrow companies, some are good, some are not so good. So you want to work closely with whatever closing agent you have on the contract and find out what the wiring instructions are so that you can give those to your buyer. Well, isn't that the escrow agent's job? Well, it's kind of your job because you're responsible for making sure earnest monies get handled. So yes, escrow is holding it, and there are, we have to know their instructions, but it actually is your job, not the escrow company's job, to make sure that you get the instructions to your client. And then sometimes escrow, when they send the FedEx label, it sometimes is also late as well because it takes them another day to get it processed and overnighted to the escrow company. Let's go to the next slide. And these are some examples of temporary receipts. Sometimes they'll issue these. This does not mean it's actually in their escrow account. So make sure that you keep these temporary earnest money receipts, send them into the firm, because that shows us proof that there was proper handling that was done. There have been other times where we've been cited as a company for maybe late or missing earnest money receipts that were, maybe we didn't get them from the escrow company. And so we've been able to provide this to show that our brokers did, in fact, get a temporary earnest money receipt. And then we had to call the escrow company to get the actual receipt. And so at least showed that we were on top of the files, albeit sometimes they were late. And we had to make some notes about that in the file. Okay, so those are all, any kind of things like that we want to see. First American has a ZOCAM. This is actually quite common. Please, if you could just download it or send it into the file, into support@bestchoicerealtylaw.com. Make sure you attach this. That also counts as a receipt. And we want to make sure we have proper dates and timestamps on these ZOCAM type receipts as well. If you are the one that's handling the receipt, maybe it's like that one instance where they're going down to California, you've got them pen to paper, also signing the contract, and they also need to get their earnest money turned in. You need some sort of receipt. If you're handling the money or you're taking it to escrow for them, you can still do that. You just need to have some sort of receipt. And so we do have an earnest money transfer receipt that just like escrow, it's a temporary, kind of like a hold, like we're holding it for them. And then we're actually taking this, including it into the transaction file, but then also getting a receipt from escrow showing that it was deposited appropriately. Next slide. Now we're getting into the additional clauses, which I'm wrapping up. So be prepared to ask your questions. But many of you have asked me, Rochelle, I want to win. I'm tired of losing on some of these deals. And so I just want to write earnest money is non-refundable. Is that proper? Is that legal? And I will give you an example very quickly. It should not be written like this. I see this a lot, and so does Jerry Kay, and we need to stop our colleagues from doing that and countering, because this can get yourself in a lot of trouble. We had a close call recently with Skyline. We represented the seller, and the buyer was attempting to write it like this. And guess what? They didn't actually even have the $50,000. It was a fraudster. And so we avoided this by basically exiting the contract. But even if we were to make the earnest money, buyer agrees to make the earnest money $50,000 non-refundable, make it early release to seller upon the receipt of escrow. I mean, this is not good. So in essence, when somebody writes that into a contract or puts that on a 36 or on a form 34, they're practicing law, and it's not written correctly, number one. And number two, what happens if the buyer breaches, or the money doesn't get into escrow, or the seller defaults? What happens when those things occur? So you want to be careful. We're not using that one sentence. You want to use the clause that's in our additional addendum, or with a slight modification to it, with instruction from me or from our managing broker, where the earnest money will be released within a certain period of time. So it clears escrow, and that we clear some of these other important timelines like Form 17 and things of that nature that have to be cleared sometimes in the contracts. And when due for release, it becomes a non-refundable deposit applicable towards the sales price. As the way the upper one was written, the $50,000 non-refundable, is that just a $50,000 credit to the seller, or is it applicable to the purchase price? It's not very clear. And like I said, we had a very close call. We ended up just canceling the deal and doing a 51 rescission and exiting on that Skyline transaction. But we see this stuff a lot in the office. So don't be the one that writes language like the top. Make sure you're using proper language, or you have written that in, because that's where we run into some problems, is when you're not using the right language. And other people have asked me, can I use the Windermere one? Can I use the Keller Williams one? I have built really good relationships with a lot of these firms. The ones I'm really cautious about are the ones where it's literally typed in, where it's not on a letterhead, or it's not on their form, and it's not been approved language by an attorney. Those are the ones that give me a lot of pause. So we have our language in term 3 on the additional clauses. It's right there. So if you use the purchase and sale agreement additional clauses, the Best Choice Realty puts together, you could simply check box number 3, and that is sufficient as far as making it non-refundable. However, many of you don't like, okay, well, does that mean I can have a title contingency and an inspection contingency? You got to consider that you may not have any contingencies because it says that the earnest money is basically the seller's turned into a deposit and is in the seller's possession. So if you exit the contract, it can be kind of sticky. And in those circumstances, you'll want to talk with me or with Jerry Kay and have us help you in modifying the earnest money non-refundable deposit slightly. And there might be some instances where we can help you there. Okay. And the form number is on this one. It's in our forms sections in the downloads on our website. And it also is in Transaction Desk as documents. So it's in that tab. You'll see the purchase and sale additional clauses, and then you can include it into your package and drag and drop the appropriate buyer, seller address and the date, and then have your buyer sign it and make it part of the contract. So we made it pretty easy. It's in Transaction Desk, or if you need to download it, it would be in the downloads on our website. Okay, let's go to the Q&A. Shannon, if you want to open up the line, I think there were some questions that came through.
Yeah, I had a couple that came through. Number one is, maybe they missed the first bit of the call, but how many days should I indicate on the first page of the purchase and sale for earnest money to be delivered?
It's a great question. It really comes down to where are the funds located? Is the client going to go to their bank? Is it 5 o'clock at night, or is their bank closed? I mean, you really have to get into the nitty gritty with your buyer to determine where are those funds. Are those funds in the form of a cashier's check? Is those funds, are they ready to wire the money? When is their wire cut off with their bank? Who do they bank with? Those are some of the questions I would ask before I write something up. This quickest one I've seen is 2, but after talking with Jerry Kay, I was like, if almost half of our earnest monies are late, might want to extend that to 3 or 5 days. And I think I've spoken with a few managing brokers that feel the same way. It just takes some time to get all of those, things opened and escrow, getting the documents and all of that. But certainly if you're in a multiple offer situation, the quicker you can get it, the better, which means it needs to be liquid. Maybe it's a cashier's check. Maybe it's, you get the wiring instructions from the moment you get mutual. And then that way you could potentially do it in, I would say 2 days would be the soonest that I would want to see it.
Another question we had that came through is, and obviously the forms changed in March, so what we had said in the past, it doesn't necessarily apply because we've got new MLS forms that we're working with, but how does the Form 89 apply towards computation of time for delivery of earnest money? It used to give us additional time. Does it now?
No. So that's all been old stuff. So we got to teach old dogs to learn new tricks, right? And so if you are wanting that additional time to collect the earnest money and get it deposited, you probably want to just change the timeline on the first page of the purchase and sale to be 5 days rather than 2, 3. It gives you that flexibility, I would say, to have that conversation determined. There is not, as far as a Form 89, no. I mean, we're not seeing those anymore. What we would like to see is more communication. So if there's a slide, Shan, that talks about the addendum, just a simple addendum. If the parties agree that the earnest money is going to be changed or modified, the delivery, if buyer and seller both agree and sign that Form 34, then we are mutual. We have an agreement, and you're not going to run the risk that they're going to cancel the deal on you. Say, for example, you had a problem getting that earnest money turned in, you might want to send over a Form 34 and just, see if the seller would be agreeable to extend that from 2 days to 5 days, for example. In that instance with, people are dealing with COVID, or they have to get their bank, or the bank closed on them, or the ferries were not operating, whatever that circumstance may be, the sooner you know that you're going to be running into problems, the better it would be for you to contact that listing agent and say, hey, we're running into some problems. How do we get this addressed? A note in the file, communication between both parties is all the Department of Licensing wants to see. As far as having an addendum, it's not required to have an addendum if both parties agree and we progress through through closing. That doesn't constitute a problem. And that's a new thing that a lot of designated brokers, when we were learning the new contract, were like, whoa, that's a massive shift, because the auditors were actually making us do the Form 89s. And Annie Fitzsimmons, if a lot of you watch her, was like, wow, that's way out of line for the auditors to require that. And we provided her information, and she's done some updates. But it's going to be an adjustment to kind of retrain the auditors on how Washington state contracts are done. And now when they've changed the first page where you actually put the date, we're having less problems with using there's no need for the Form 89s at this point. There just needs to be dialogue and obviously proper notice given when you're wanting to deal with those late earnest money checks. Okay.
Another question is, it really just, I think you might have answered this, but if both parties are okay with a delay in earnest money, I mean, how do we really handle that in terms of, should we do a Form 34? Should we just have written communication?
It really depends on who you're working with on the other side and the situation. Are you in a multiple offer situation? Are you worried that you're going to get, sent a notice? I would certainly want to have a Form 34 where the seller agrees that the earnest money provision has been extended to, and then the date.
And a couple questions came through about the additional clauses that we were sharing on the screen. It's available in Transaction Desk, and it also is available on our website at bestchoicerealtyhomes.com. You'll need to create your login if you haven't already, but it is replacing the BCR 22D. So if you're using the old one, you still can, it's fine. But it is intended to replace that form. A lot of people are getting really good success from it. It looks like people are commenting on that, which is great.
Yep.
And let's see, I had another question. Some of my buyers felt uncomfortable releasing earnest money after we wrote a few offers, and they realized that it's not the norm right now. Do you see this as a trend going away? Is it going to basically become the normal? What do you foresee, Rochelle?
As far as non-refundable becoming, I think more education and understanding that the sellers and the buyers, what earnest money is and how that, I think it's going to be interesting to see how people, as the market changes, I think it will also change that earnest money non-refundable bit. It's the way people explain it too. They say, I want your earnest money non-refundable. It's like, wow, these demands. It's like, oh my gosh, it's like we're at that point. But I'm seeing some more easing back into the way we've been doing things with better education. And obviously there is some more inventory that's popped up. So it's not as, in certain areas, it's not as crazy, but still crazy. But I think that proper education is needed in order for the buyers, agents, and listing agents to work together on that.
So there's hope, right?
Yes.
Yes. And one last really great question is how to handle earnest money in regards to land and feasibilities.
Great question.
What's different? What should I keep in mind? That sort of thing.
Yeah, I learned it best from somebody he's the landman. I don't know if you guys know him. He's out on the Kitsap Peninsula. He's been doing it a long time. And he told me, he goes, land is kind of an interesting thing, right? Where you actually have, there's levers when you're looking at the contract and you're trying to determine if you've got multiple offers on a piece of land, it comes down to price, comes down to earnest money, and then some feasibility. So there's these different levers. And so obviously if the feasibility is longer, that might not be desirable for the seller, but maybe there's an earnest money that's put into escrow and it's significant. Or there might be a higher purchase price, but there's these levers that people will often, do I increase that? Do I make it a note? It's just unique in the sense that you don't have the negotiation. You only have a few levers that you can kind of push or prod. And like, for example, I had a piece of land. It's like the seller wanted to clear and go buy their retirement home over there in Yakima. And it was, a sizable piece of land, a plat, and we're working with the builder, and the builder came and offered us a 1-year feasibility, right? Earnest money of like, it was sizable. It was $75,000, but they put it in escrow. So that was nice. And then they had a purchase price that was ridiculously low. I mean, my sellers were like out of the question. And so I went back to the builder and I said, you know what, you really offended them on the purchase price. Can we work and massage maybe the feasibility, and then make that earnest money part of it, you know, give it to them so they can help with their moving expenses to kind of, again, you have to think creatively, help them with their purchase. Can we release some of that, a portion of the $75,000 upon mutual acceptance, and make that work? And the answer was yes. We actually came, I couldn't believe the deal actually came together. And now there's seven properties, 7 homes on this one plot of land. And it was amazing. The builder won, but then I don't think he understood the levers on how to kind of, what was important to the seller. Earnest money is a portion of that. A portion of that earnest money being non-refundable was important to that particular seller who was ended up purchasing another house and needed some of that cash rather than waiting for an entire year to get cashed out of that land situation. So great question, but it's probably in a whole nother 30-day session to learn how to do land. And the landman was very helpful back in the day when I learned from the landman.
I think that's all that came through, but that was a great questions that were coming through. Is there anything else that they need to keep in mind, Rochelle?
Yeah, I would just be very careful if somebody's like, you need to have your earnest money non-refundable, and you get these demanding type listing agents. They're probably demanding because they're expecting multiple offers. And there is a way to deal with that, but you do want to caution your buyers about those types of sellers. You might want to, you know, look at other options. It might go out of their price range. It might not be best suited for them. And to be put in that situation like that, it's not fun.
Rochelle?
Yes, go ahead.
Can I just say one thing? I know I just wanted to comment just because we had this recent situation with one of my clients. I know that this sounds, this is probably a rookie mistake on my part, but to verify the amount of funds
Yes.
for earnest money, for ADs, things like that. I know that we're talking about earnest money.
Right.
You know, it's, I guess, especially if you're going to get into $50,000 or $125,000, that funds are available, that people aren't just, I mean, I obviously felt that I had a good relationship and I was being told the truth, but possibly, trust but verify or whatever it is, you know, and everything like that. So.
Yeah, I mean, you get that gut feeling too. You know, it's probably right. We had one that was like a Charles Schwab account. They actually manufactured the proof of funds, and it was completely fraudulent. We verified because to your point, right? We want to make sure this was legitimate, sizable, and we found out it was a fraud. I mean, so at that point, we want out. We don't want to work with somebody that's going to be a fraudster and string people out for a year or two. You know, so you definitely want to verify. Even earnest money, especially if it's that sizable and you're taking the clients home and putting them in a situation where they have to move to another house, you just want to make sure you're working with legitimate, you know, working deals and people that are telling the truth.
I would mention too, and kind of echo on that, is that if you're working with sellers, we've had a situation in the past where earnest money was delivered. We got the receipt and everything like that from, you know, the big title company, First American Chicago, one of those, and the check bounced. So, I mean, you just have to make sure that the checks are cleared and it is a verified earnest money deposit receipt. So.
Yep, good point. Awesome. Well, hopefully that was informative for all of you. And if there are instances where you need some help, you know, Candace is available. I'm available. We had a busy day. It's good, very busy Monday, but also a very good month in May. We had a fantastic month, record breaking for best choice. So I know there's a lot of good things going on, and I appreciate all your time and attention today, and keep writing some good stuff.